I was really hoping that we would have Dr. Peter Thiel here with us to talk on this subject. We picked out these subjects, and Dr. Thiel unfortunately had to abstain. Many of you guys know Dr. Thiel from Aarhus University, who I highly respect, but he's undergone some health challenges, and so I want to send out thoughts and prayers for him and his family that he wasn't able to join us, but instead you get me. So hopefully we have some good information to share, and if I can figure out my two clickers here pretty well. Just to give you an outline of what we're going to talk about today. First, I want to spend a little bit of time peeling back our breakouts, because I think we had, at least in my session, we had some great discussion, and I know I was sad that I couldn't get to go to all three of them. So we'll talk about that. And I want to give a little bit of background on lactation feed intake, what we knew, what we know now, what maybe we have yet to learn. And I want to talk about observational study that me and my team in the U.S., in light of Peter Thiel's situation, we commissioned quickly to put together some good information for you guys and the results and compare it to some of the research from the 90s. And then I want to talk briefly as well about how we can optimize feed intake and lactation, because I think that's a topic that we often skim over in nutrition as we look at the average deliveries. And hopefully we'll have time for questions. So the nutrition breakout sessions, I hope everybody got the chance to attend and participate. I know in our session there was really good dialogue and back and forth, but I asked each of the other moderators to give me kind of a rundown of what they saw and felt following the breakout. And the first one that I talked to was Amanda on mitigating heat stress and lactation. And the big question that was asked at the beginning is nutrition the problem, or is management the problem on heat stress and lactation? And it sounded like there was a pretty good consensus in the room that management is the challenge that we continue to have, and that maybe nutrition alone is not going to be our solution for management and heat stress and lactation. So I think everybody was on the same page, was 100% voting that way, but it sounded like some conversations ensued about how we can manage feeding differently in that breakout. I was interested to hear more about the heat increment of sows with larger meals and with intake during the hot part of the day. It sounded like there were some conversations about feeding sows at night, which is an interesting topic that we've looked at in some of our U.S. farms, looking at feeding sows in the middle of the night to try to offset some heat stress impacts. So I'm interested to hear more about that and hopefully get some rundown from those of you in the audience, and hopefully you guys came away with some good nuggets. The second breakout session was on changing diets in gestation, and should we be doing it? I think most people acknowledge that they're not doing that today in their systems, but according to Sam, who led that from the Jyga side of things, I believe there was 18 people at the beginning that were in favor of feeding different gestating diets and 7 against. And at the end of the session, there were still 18 people in favor of it, but there was only 4 against. So a few people at least decided not to vote no anymore. So that was interesting. But it sounded like they had a lot of good discussions. I think one of them was centered around transition diets. And it sounded like generally the participants in that session would like to do more with transition diets. The challenge is how to implement it. There were discussions about whether we need to relocate the sow, or do we get the feed to the sow? And it sounded like relocating the sows in today's labor environment is not very practical. So if we're going to be able to implement transition diets, we probably need to find ways to bring the feed to the sows. And I'm, of course, interested in how we can help do that from a Jyga standpoint to help reach the goals of the biology. In my session, I was probably as vested in this session as anything, because I get a lot of questions and I've had lots of conversations about gilt development and continue to go to a lot of systems who are frustrated with gilt challenges that we then inherit in the sow farm. And we see this in a lot of breeding projects on new barns. So the question that we had in the gilt growth seminar or breakout was, is ad libitum feeding of the modern gilt still the right approach? So in this one, we weren't quite as one-sided. At the beginning, we had 12 people that voted yes, we should still be ad libitum feeding the gilt all the way through. And I believe we had 8 say no. And we had a few abstain. So pretty balanced there in terms of for and against. And at the end, we had 13 said yes, and 9 said no. So there was a lot of good discussion in my room, and a lot of questions about how and why and when and how it impacts the first litter, the P1 as she gets into gestation. I thought one of the takeaways that was kind of a good encapsulation of the discussion is that if we're going to talk about some type of restriction for the modern gilt, maybe we need to use a term like optimizing feed intake, not restricting feed intake, because we definitely have some production systems that get pretty nervous when we talk about slowing down or restricting animals. And so I thought that was a good point, because I think many people recognize that there are some opportunities if we can find ways to maybe manage growth or optimize growth in the growing gilt, but how we do it still remains a discussion. And there was a lot of very good engaging discussions in my room. So I was glad I had the chance to be a part of that. So hopefully you guys all had good takeaways from yours, and you talked to each other about what was discussed in the other rooms. And I know this was one area that we were challenged on, to have some good take-home points for you guys as you leave. You're not just up here listening to the keynote speakers. So for my topic today, I'm going to talk about lactation feed intake, as we discussed. And this kind of stems back to when Amanda and I and our team was talking about how we wanted to set up this event and what topics to discuss. And I'm really happy with our other speakers and the topics we were able to touch on. But lactation feed intake is pretty near and dear to us at GESTAL, because we've had a lactation feeder on the market for 25 plus years, and we kind of get to see a lot of things about feed intake and lactation. So my initial thought was, I don't want to talk up here. I want to get experts from the industry. And the two people that I guess I think have published the most and are as respected as any in my life is Yozu Kiketsu from Japan, and Peter Thiel from Aarhus University. And so we reached out to both of them, and initially Peter had accepted to join us, and obviously he was unable to. And Dr. Kiketsu is a little bit less able to make the long trip from Japan at his age, but I got to share some good commentary with him about this topic after I took the reins on myself. So in light of those speakers, I fell back to ourselves and said, okay, we want to make sure we have good content for you guys here around the room. And if we have nothing else at GESTAL, we have a lot of lactation data, lots of it, right? And a matter of peeling that back and sorting it is always the challenge. But we thought we had the opportunity here to talk about some of the things that we see, and maybe just present what goes on in sow farms today, and get some feedback from you guys. Maybe challenge some conventional norms as well. So I want to start with some of Kiketsu's work that I refer back to often in my literature reviews. He did a lot of good work in the mid-90s based out of the University of Minnesota. And they actually captured records using the PigChamp data system at the time. And although prior to that study, everyone understood that not eating well in lactation was bad, there was little really known or well documented about the different feed consumption factors on commercial farms. So they, at the time, collected data from U.S. farms in Iowa and Minnesota for the entire year of 1991. So they got seasonality encapsulated in that, and they asked workers on the farm to collect feed intake data with all of their sows, which they were able to do because at that time they were hand feeding all of those sows. So there was a little more ability to capture that, although I'm sure it probably took some convincing on some of those farms. But they did get data from 30 sow farms representing over 25,000 sows, which I think was pretty impressive for the early to mid-90s. And at the time, the farms were asked to make sure they record their data, but not to change their feeding management practices so that it truly encapsulated just normal commercial production. So in order to characterize the records that they found at the time, those 25,000 sow records, they broke these down into 6 different feed intake categories. And I've got a picture down at the bottom right, if my laser pointer works a little bit. This is actually a picture from a GESTAL farm, but I've got some other images like this, so I want you to be able to understand. The dark blue line is an example of how a sow's feed intake changes over the course of lactation. Some of the color codes behind that are really just representing what we would expect for that sow. So during this study with Kiketsu and others, they identified 6 different patterns. Rapid was one, and this would be a sow that was characterized as increasing in feed intake rapidly after farrowing, never having a bad day, never having a drop in feed intake. Another category that was quite common was a category called major. And in those sows, at some point in their normal lactation, there was a drop of at least 1.8 kilos or 4 pounds relative to the previous peak, and it stayed low for at least 2 days. So many of you in the audience have talked about feed crashes in lactation, or you've heard people talk about that. I would say this sow fits the crash type of mentality. Minor sows were sows that at any point in lactation had a small dip, less than 1.8 kilos, but if they ever had a bad day, but then came back afterwards, they would fall into the minor category. And I would say this example here is an example of a minor sow. Pretty normal in my experience. Low, low, low was a category that was also characterized, and this was an animal that never really got up on feed. She ate enough to stay in the crate and stay through weaning, but she had poor intake throughout lactation. Low, high, high was a sow that had low intake in early lactation, but then came up normally after a few days of being kind of off feed or slow to get up to speed. So the first 7 days did not exceed 2.7 kilos in those sows. And the last category was gradual. And these would be sows that were steadily increasing, but not as rapid as the rapid sows. So they increased every day. They didn't really have any bad days, but they peaked later in lactation. So I think that's important because I'm going to talk about those categories a lot, so I want to make sure you understand the definitions. So just to relay on a bigger screen, this is just an example of what we see in a GESTAL screen as driven by a trigger, and this is how we were able to capture some of this data last minute here in September on some of our sows. But we're looking at the blue feed intake line. This would be feed disappearance or feed delivered to a sow based on her requests using a trigger. And again, that dark blue line was actually what she requested, and the colors would represent what we'd expect of that sow on that day of lactation. So that's going to vary some by day, by parity. Within a farm, it may also be by genotype if they internally replace. But most of our farms, we would be targeting somewhere in the green, maybe towards the top of the green. In the white zone might be an indication of a sow that wants more than being allowed, so a restricted sow. We don't want that. We obviously don't want girls in the red zone that aren't eating well. So that will hopefully help you understand some of these next pictures. So to break down those incidence rates of the categories in Kiketsu work, the rapid sows, as I described, represented 17.8% of roughly 25,000 sows. So again, these are sows that basically had no off days. They increased rapidly and kept increasing. The major sows, 38%, which I think is one of, if not the highest in that study, were sows that had a crash at some point. They may have come back, but they had at least 2 days where they dropped at least 1.8 kilos. And so I think that's a decent example of a sow that would characterize as a major. Minor sows are girls that increase but have a bad day, or maybe more than one bad day, but it wasn't maintained and it wasn't more than 4 pounds. The low, low, low sows, much lower incidence in the 96 paper, 1.2%. But again, these are the girls that just pretty poor intake throughout. So pretty good thing that there's a low incidence rate there. Also low incidence in the low, high, high. These would be girls that started out low but then corrected and got up to good intake in later lactation. And the gradual sows were a little bit like rapid, although they just really didn't get up to speed as fast. They gradually increased all the way throughout lactation. So 15% of sows fell into that category. So if we look at those categories and the incidence rates, I think both in 96, that's interesting in hand-fed sows in 1991. But I think this is important for benchmarking relative to what I show later. The average of these sow records, which again were collected over the course of the year, was 5.2 kilos. And lactation length was a little bit shorter, 18.8. And we have some information on the average parity, litter weight, and litter size at that time. So 1991 is a little while ago for most of us here in the audience. Some people maybe not so long ago, but 8.7 litter size is, being below double digits there's a little concerning. So just maybe a decent background for you to see that. So here's the actual intakes by pattern back in that 91 data. So interestingly, the sows on the rapid pattern and the gradual pattern had the highest intakes. I guess it's not that interesting. That probably doesn't come as any surprise to you if you read the definitions. But sows that were low, 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 of course, were pretty low, 3.2 kilos. Low, high, high, they couldn't get quite back to their initial goal because of that low feed intake and early lactation. And sows that were in the major and minor classification were not so bad, but especially major was a little bit of a dip there. And again, 38% of the sows fell into that category of major. So the take-home message from this study, for me anyways, and there's actually 3 or 4 papers that they made out of this because they got some additional data. It's really interesting if you don't have it or haven't had the time to read those. I recommend them because there's some really nice nuggets in there. But the low, low, low and low, high, high sows in all the farms had longer wean to estrus intervals and wean to conception intervals than the other patterns. Probably not a huge surprise to you guys based on their intake. Sows with the major feed dip, or the crash that I referenced, also had a longer wean to conception ratio, had reduced weaning weight, and a higher percent of sows culled for anestrus, in spite of really having not terrible feed intake for the time, 5.1, compared to the rapid sows, or the sows that kind of had a normal type of feed program. And this was especially true in P1 females, which we spent some time on today trying to work on those P1 females, how to keep them in the herd longer. The greater intake in early lactation was correlated to a higher likelihood of feed intake drops or crashes. And I hear this in a lot of farms that we work with that are buyers of our feeders, and we're implementing feed curves. I get a lot of questions from customers that are very worried about crashing the sow if we give her too much feed in early lactation. And for many years, producers have used this data or something like this as a justification for preventing sows from crashing. And based on 38% of sows, I think there's some reasoning for that, right? But Kaketsu and others also found that feed intake in the first and second week of lactation was a better indication of performance than feed intake in the third week of lactation. And they also found that having an earlier peak day of lactation was also associated with overall feed intake. So a little bit of conflicting evidence there in the Kaketsu data about what should we really be targeting. But I want to talk now about this data and why we maybe need to revisit this in 2022. Again, I still have customers asking us as we're setting up feed curves and feeding recommendations with our feeders on how to prevent the crash of sows. It's very common and ensues a lot of conversations for people like me and Amanda to try to encourage them to give sows plenty of feed in early lactation. Remember that these sows in the data collection in 1991, although it was a lot of sows, to the best of my knowledge from the protocol, they were all hand-fed. So they had the ability to capture this data. But hand feeding is a lot different than what we see in most farms today, at least in North America, and labor challenges being a big reason for that, but also probably not coming back anytime soon that I can expect. So as we look at other things that came out of this, I think at the time rapid feed patterns was the benchmark that Kaketsu used to compare against. And at least in our data sets and in the many farms that we work with, I don't see a lot of sows with that rapid profile, because typically, at least in our farms, when I see that profile, it makes me think that these sows are limit fed. And I don't want to see that. I want my system to be limiting sows. So we really don't see a lot of rapid feed intake patterns, and yet they saw a lot of that in 1991. So it begs the question, were a decent amount of those sows limited at some point in those hand feeding situations? So I talked earlier about this type of pattern really being what I would say pretty normal feed intake variation that we see in farms. But there were a lot of patterns, if you plotted them in the Kaketsu data, that might have looked more like this, where she's maxed out. And if we're giving it with a feed scoop, there's only so much we're going to give. And of course, I think we need to recognize that if this is the best paper that I can find to really characterize feed intake, and we have to look back to the year 1991, maybe that in and of itself is a reason to look at this a little deeper, because that was 30 years ago. And I think we've maybe seen just a few little changes in our sows since then. So for the sakes of our conversation today, I want to make sure that I thank Amanda and the rest of my team from the U.S., because after we changed schedules, I said, hey, we need to capture some good data and present to the audience here. And we have the opportunity to get that data, but we still needed to make sure we analyze it properly. So everybody pitched in on this, and I appreciate their help. But we filtered through 45 of our GESTAL farms to really get down to a group of farms that we could handle in terms of the data analysis, as well as ones that we felt would represent the broader industry, because this isn't just a GESTAL talk, this is about feed intake for all sows. And we excluded some farms that we felt were doing some things that maybe didn't the context. And so of the 45, we kept 12, and the ones that were excluded were those that had feed restriction in early lactation, inconsistent calibration, that maybe the data wasn't quite as accurate, or average feed intake that was concerningly low. And I consider less than 5 kilos today concerningly low, even though in 91 the average was 5.2. So that says something right there and then. So of that, after screening that down to 12 farms, we ended up with just under 13,000 records from 12 farms in North and South America. Sorry to those of you in Europe, but we got some. We filtered out some there, and we kept some North American and South American farms, and we again fell into a full year. We wanted to get a whole year and have seasonality encapsulated in that, so we capture that data between September of last year and September of this year. So hopefully that wraps that around that. So here for these 12 farms, and we've blinded them for sakes of protecting the owners of the farms, because we did get their permission, but we didn't want to expose any of them for their differences here. But we actually did screen this down to around 1,000 sows per farm, and we got that by going down to certain rooms and getting the whole room for the whole farm for the year. But this is an example of the records we got from each farm, the actual lactation length of these farms based on those that were filtered, the peak day of lactation on those farms on average, and probably the one that I'll spend the most time on is what was their average daily feed intake by farm. And I have the standard deviation reflected there as well. But we had a pretty big range in feed intake from, I think, as low as mid 5.5 kilos up to upper 7s, and not necessarily on the longest lactation length either. So a pretty good range there, but representing what we see pretty normally in the field. So just to chart out when did peak lactation intake occur, because this is the data we had, it looks to me like based on these farms, our most common time of peak lactation intake was around that day 18, 19, 20 of lactation. And then we have a lot of farms that this would match my experience, that kind of the sow plateaus a little bit after that time. So we usually get a pretty steady intake up until the end of the third week of lactation, and then little to no increase after that, at least in this data set. So, and again, I want to make sure I mention that this is this data set, but one of the things that was surprising to me out of the herds that we chose was I expected that those farms with the longer lactation length would also have significantly higher feed intake. And again, maybe it's just because of the 12 farms we chose, but 13,000 sows with individual lactation lengths, I would have expected it to still show up here. But we had no correlation between lactation length and feed intake. And some of our shorter lactation lengths actually had pretty competitive feed intakes, and just because they had a longer lactation length didn't necessarily mean that they were significantly higher. And so that was one surprise for me in the data set, and just basically no correlation to lactation length. So before I get into the incidence rates of the categories, and that's where I really want the meat of our conversation to be, we did have to differentiate a couple things in the categories from the Kiketsu research in '96. So, and those differences are important because they may impact the incidence. But for the rapid feed intake profile, we wanted to add, in addition to the fact that it increased rapidly with no drop, we added that the sow had to peak early and around before day 10 of lactation, which wasn't specified in the first paper because we were having trouble differentiating rapid and gradual sows in our research, and I'm not sure how they resolved that in Kiketsu's work, but they mentioned that those were the two hardest ones to differentiate. The major, we left the same. I think it was a great description of a sow experiencing some type of feed crash. More than 1.8 kilos, staying low for 2 days. We kept that. I thought that was perfect. For the minor sows, we did add one little clarification point that at any point a minor decrease was what fit a minor sow, but she had to do it for 2 days. So if we had a sow that just had 1 day where she was a half a pound less than the previous day, we didn't necessarily call her minor. But if she had a couple blips, we called her fitting into that minor category. Low, we still kept the general principle. That was the low intake sows, but instead of being under 8 pounds or something that it was before, we changed that to 5.5 kilos, or it was under 10 pounds before. We raised that to 5.5 kilos because we really didn't have very many of them that were that low, below 10 pounds. There's a lot of farms that had almost no incidence of that. So we felt that low is still concerning if it's under 5.5 kilos today. Low, high, we just changed that a little bit to less than 10 pounds for the first 7 days. If they stayed low and then peaked after that, they still classified as that low, high. The gradual feed curve, we left the same, but I just want to emphasize that it's girls that peaked after day 10 of lactation. That's the differentiation between gradual and rapid. So with those definitions, I want to maybe spend a little time comparing what we found in our data set versus what Kiketsu found. The rapid sows, pretty common in the Kiketsu work from the 90s. We only had 1.8% of our sows fitting that rapid pattern. And again, I mentioned that maybe limit feeding was a little bit of a reason for that, but we also updated the definition. So a lot of those sows that might have fallen into rapid did not peak before day 10. They peaked after day 10. For the sows that crashed, the major sows, one of the things that was a big takeaway from his work in the 90s that caused some farms to not want to make sows crash, they had 38%. We only saw 15.5%. So for the 2022 sows, I consider that a good thing. I think that's good. But still 15%, so quite a few sows that did that. For the minor sows, we had a few more, 41%. Generally, again, I don't get too worked up about a sow that has one off day if she comes back. So still pretty high incidence of both of those. Low, 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 still pretty low incidence rates compared to the data from the 90s. Low, high, high, also low, but 7.3 versus 1.5. A little interesting that we had such a higher level there. And for the gradual feed curve, again, was the one that was tougher to differentiate in the first work. We had a higher percent of sows that fit into the gradual category that peaked after day 10 as compared to Kiketsu in 96. So if we look at that, I also want to point out the range of our farms. So we had 12 farms, so we could look at the high and low incidence of each farm that had about 1,000 records represented. The maximum of each of those categories is reflected now, as well as the minimum by farm that we saw. I think this is maybe one of the key takeaways from the study is the fact that within 12 farms that we really screened to be managed pretty similarly, the incidence of these different patterns was quite different. And we had some farms that stood out, and Amanda and I double-checked to make sure that we thought things were being managed right or checked right, and sure enough, there's just that much variation between all farms that are on the GESTAL system and undergoing things pretty similarly. And so that in and of itself is an interesting point. So if we look at that as far as some of the key points, I think it's interesting to note that overall average daily feed intake is quite a bit higher in 2022 than it was in 91. Probably not a big surprise to anyone, but at least in our data set, we were averaging 6.4 kilos per day. Those of you in the audience that have access to feed deliveries and feed amounts, I guess I'd be curious where your farms sit on that, but I feel pretty decent about that 6.4 average. But I know some of the feed intake studies that I see published today out of many universities and such still tend to be a lot closer to 5.2 than 6.4, and that remains a concern for me. Our lactation length was a little longer, which probably I would have expected that to contribute to some of that additional feed intake, although our data didn't necessarily agree with that internally. The major minor feed patterns occurred frequently in both data sets. We had a lot of those sows then, we have a lot of those sows now, still about 2/3 of your sows. However, we had less major sows, less sows that crashed, and I think that's good because I really want to shut down the people that ask me how to prevent the sows from crashing, because I want them to get up on feed. I give sows access to feed, and a lot of those sows do bounce back, not necessarily crash for the entire lactation. So, there we go, I backed up my slide. So, and per the 22 definition, the definition that we updated, the rapid sows were a lot less common today than they were at least in the data set in 91. So that's a little bit interesting of why. And as I mentioned before, Kiketsu noted that differentiating rapid and gradual were the toughest differentiation based on their definition. And so if you say, hey, both of those sow profiles are generally good eating sows that are doing things right, both studies had 33% of the sows fitting into that profile. I wish it was higher. 1/3 of your sows eating well every day is not as great as we'd like it to be, but it is consistent. So that's interesting in 30 years that hasn't changed. So one of the things that concerned me out of our data set was the incidence of the low, low, low sows and the low, high, high sows were many multiples of what we saw in the previous data. 2 times and 5 times more common in today's sows. And remember that in the Kiketsu work, these patterns as well as major were ones that actually had poor reproductive performance. We didn't have the ability to capture that with the data we had, but it was pretty well defined in the 90s that hurt performance. And so the fact that we're seeing more of those today concerns me a little bit in early lactation. This still represents a total of 25% of sows today when you include the major sows. I already talked about the variation between individual farms being high and the incidence rate, and I think that's something that you guys all need to take back to your systems. And I guess if you have the ability to capture this, understanding the variation in these patterns might be a clue to how you can do a better job in lactation. But one of the things that's also interesting that I failed to show a slide of here, but the variation by day was interesting to look at as well. So the coefficient of variation in these farms was around 20%. So within each farm, there was about 20% variation in feed intake, and that's pretty high, but that's pretty normal for what we see. And so if you're only looking at feed deliveries and not truly appreciating the variation that exists in your herd, I think that's something I challenge you to understand a little bit better. But I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all approach, because one of the farms that had the highest incidence of low sows, they had 11%, didn't even have the lowest overall feed intake. They were in the middle. And so I was one that I took a little deeper dive on because I was concerned about why that one was so high, but they even found a way to exceed the average feed intake. And what about the crash, the major sows, that people still talk about to this day? I think the crash was one that I was trying to figure out, okay, of those major sows, when is the greatest dip in feed intake? And we could look at that because we had that day-to-day intake variation. So I looked at where was the biggest drop relative to the previous day's amount. And of all the sows, this is the histogram showing what day of lactation that occurred, and we had less records out at the longer lactation length. So I kind of saw this as a big nothing burger that looks like there's drops regardless of where it's at in lactation. We have quite a few drops wherever, right? Maybe it makes sense in higher intake days we could have a little bigger drop. But I didn't take away from that there's a key time that the biggest crash is occurring if there is one. If I go to the major sows, the 15% of sows that did have a 1.8 kilo or bigger drop, it was interesting that occurred more often here in the first week of lactation because it was the biggest decrease, right? So even if their intake was not good, they still had the biggest dip from the previous day. And so it does show that those major sows are having that impact probably in the first week to 10 days of lactation primarily. That's when that crash is occurring. And for those of you that spend a lot of time in farrowing barns, that probably matches what you've seen if those girls that go off feed. At least for me it does. So in my conversations with Dr. Kaketsu, as I was getting ready to survey some of his work, one of the things that he made sure to point out to me is that he really believes that there are no average sows. And I think this data really shows that, right? There's a lot of variation between farm, within farm, between 91 and 2022. And unfortunately, as nutritionists, many of you have your hands tied a little bit on what data you get to look at, right? You don't have access to all of this variation in feed intake. But the message, I think, is pretty clear that in lactation, at least, variation is something that we have to deal with. And I don't know that we in all of our farms today are doing a great job of reacting to the variation that exists. And some of those low, high incidence rates maybe point to the fact that we're not reacting to those as quickly as we could. And maybe we did a better job with that when we had hand feeding. So as I transition towards the end of my talk here, let's talk about how we can optimize feed intake in lactation. And taking this data set as a good example, I think it's pretty clear that for both the low, the low, high, and the major profiles that were linked to poor reproductive performance and fertility and weaning weight, those problems are happening in the first week of lactation. And so I hope many of you are counseling your workers to pay especially good attention to those girls in the first week of lactation. But at least in this study and in Kaketsu's work, if you can get them going good by day 7, they're pretty self-sufficient after that. There aren't very many of them that are crashing after that time point. And I really wanted to kind of peel back the layers on what was different amongst the farms that we chose, and of what we thought were pretty good farms. And one of the things that was interesting to me as I went back and peeled through these is the farm that actually had the greatest feed intake, which was around 7.8 kilos, which I think most of you would vote pretty good intake for a 20-day lactation length. They had the lowest incidence of the 3 problem categories, low, high, and major, of all 12. That was one of the things that stood out to me, is that they had the lowest percentage of all 3 of those relative to the other 12 of the data set we had. So it tells me maybe they're doing some other things right, but they're definitely not having as many of those girls, and I think that's a testament to some of the things that they're doing in management, assuming that in early lactation or pre-farrow, they're getting some things right to keep those girls on feed and fitting into one of those other profiles. And interestingly enough, I checked the second best farm on feed intake, and they were second to fourth lowest in all three of those categories. So I think if you have access to this data, trying to really parse out where and when are those profiles occurring, that might be a benchmark for your farms to measure against, to benchmark against, to really try to get improved feed intake in lactation. And that farm that had the second best intake was actually on 18-day lactation too, which was interesting to me as well. So as we talk about this and may hopefully agree that we can maybe focus on those girls that fit that profile, I think this is a challenge for you guys as nutritionists, as production leaders in your systems. What tools can you provide to your farms so that they can hopefully find these girls faster and react to them faster? You know, we obviously screened this amongst GESTAL farms, but we have access to that data, and I'd say go back home with some challenges to yourself to find how to find these girls faster and react to them to get them back up on feed, because if we can reduce the incidence of those categories, I think we can definitely make some improvement in feed intake across these farms. So, a few additional points before we wrap up. I will admit that an observational study done in the past 30 days does have some limits, right? We have some things that we don't for sure know, so maybe you don't take everything as gospel, but I think there's some very good points that we brought up. Both in 1991 and still today, we noticed that we still have some farms limiting some sows. And so even some of the farms that we filtered out, and we're going to go back and talk to some of them and say, hey, you guys are limiting a few too many sows, and we need to get rid of that. You know, we don't want to limit lactation intake. So I think that's something to watch for depending on what your feeding strategies are on your farms. I think body condition management, we've talked about in gestation on several different talks today, and pre-farrowing feed management remains a challenge and an opportunity. I think there's some connections to the pre-farrowing feeding strategies about feeding multiple meals per day, maybe feeding them more at night to help get them to offset some heat increment or get more of them to farrow during the day, as we've collected some data on. I think there's some opportunities in what we can do in pre-farrowing feed management that can influence some of the data presented here. And there, that touches on my next point here, that basically we've got some additional research that we're collecting, because I think an opportunity for some of these feeders is to change the way that these sows are transitioning on to feed out of gestation and into lactation. And hopefully we can use these tools to optimize their intake in lactation. And lastly, I wish I'd had more data to bring on this, because this is a topic that I keep annoying Amanda with when I talk about it all the time. But I think at some point as a group, we need to think about or maybe talk about feed efficiency in lactation. As an industry, we're so focused on making sure we get enough intake into these sows, which is, of course, the most important thing we do. But we focus so much on feed efficiency across the world in every other production phase, but we just kind of ignore feed efficiency a little bit in lactation because we're just trying to get as much feed into these girls as possible. And at least in our data sets, which I didn't necessarily have filtered well enough to be able to present to you, we see some sows that don't do a lot with the feed they eat. We see some good eating sows that don't necessarily translate that into weaning weight or body condition. And conversely, we have some sows that eat great and milk great and wean a huge litter and then breed back right away. And I think for those in the genetics industry and those of you in systems that are able to do some of this yourself, being able to select for or filter those sows faster that have really good lactational feed efficiency might be an opportunity that we can help improve the quality of our females in our herds. And I think that's a next frontier opportunity. And maybe we can get everybody averaging 7 kilos a day of intake, but I think we ought to be talking about feed efficiency and lactation. So I will also acknowledge that sow performance has changed dramatically in 30 years, but back to what Kaketsu said, there are no average sows. I think that remains true today, and the variation that hopefully you guys saw is I think real amongst those of you in the audience, and hopefully we can continue to understand that and figure out how we can reduce variation, because as I looked at the farms that had the least day-to-day variation and CVs, I think I told you guys the average intake variation was 20% CV by farm. The lowest farms had a 13% CV. There was 4 of them that were all around 13%. Guess what they also all 4 had? First to fourth highest feed intake. And I wish I'd had that slide, but I was peeling through the data Monday night, and I wish I'd had a chance to put that on there. But the feed intake correlated to the least variation. And I think that was kind of interesting as well. So with that, I will be happy to face any questions and appreciate your attention and time.